Assalamu alaikum. This is Mehnaz Akber Aziz with LifeTalks. And we are face to face with Professor Naila Kabeer. Professor Kabeer is Emeritus Professor of Department of International Development and faculty member of the International Institute of Inequalities at the London School of Economics. Her focus is on gender, poverty, livelihood, social protection, and pathways to citizenship. Recently, her new book has been launched, Renegotiating Patriarchy, Gender, Agency, and Bangladesh Paradox. So we'll start with our chat with Professor Naila on her book about the paradox that exists in Bangladesh and where are we now. So we have a lot of lessons to learn, and then we'll compare it to the Pakistan situation as well. Dr. Kabeer, over to you.
First of all, I must say I'm very pleased to be here and reaching an audience in Pakistan. So this book, you have to understand what we mean by the Bangladesh paradox. So, the paradox refers to things that are unexpected. Yeah. Somehow they don't conform to the received wisdom. So the Bangladesh paradox relates to the fact that in 1971, when we got our independence, Bangladesh was probably one of the poorest countries in the world. It had very high rates of fertility. They often talked about Malthusian disaster. It had, very strong patriarchy, and it had one government after another that was not particularly responsive to the needs of people. And then, of course, as you know, in the international literature, being a Muslim majority state was seen as almost synonymous with having very poor indicators on gender equality. Now, Bangladesh was known as the test case for development in 71, that if Bangladesh managed to make any progress, then anyone could make any progress. It was called a basket case. I think around the 80s, or around that time, certain indicators started to alert people to change that was unexpected. It began with a decline in fertility rates. In fact, Bangladesh had one of the most rapid fertility rate declines in demographic record. Unexpected. It was followed by declines in infant and child mortality. That was then followed by improvements in education. But what captured my attention and why I wanted to write this book is all of these were both pro-poor, the poor benefited better than the wealthy, and gender equitable. They resulted in the closing of the gender gap in inequalities in all of these indicators. But above all, my PhD research touched on the issue of son preference. As you know, Pakistan, yes, Northern India, Bangladesh, we are cultures of very strong son preference. And girls die in larger numbers than boys before the age of 5. In Bangladesh, we started to see an increase in the chances of girls surviving, to the extent by the 1990s, girls were 20% more likely to survive than boys, which is the norm in the rest of the world. So I was very fascinated. Look what is going on, that gender inequalities are being reduced and daughters are rising in the estimation of their parents. So I went back to the village in which I did my PhD.
And
which was in Faridpur.
Okay, Faridpur.
Villages remain anonymous,
Okay.
But it was a village in Faridpur. So I went back, and through qualitative research, I thought that everybody actually believed that, yes, daughter preference it's not daughter preference, it's son preference is declining. Parents are valuing their daughters much more. And they also agreed that women's agency was increasing. In fact, some people thought it's increasing too much. Women are getting too forward. But of course, that's not necessarily true. So I went back, I did a survey in that village, and I did more detailed qualitative research, and I found, yes, indeed, parents all agreed that there was much greater value given to daughters. And shall I tell you why?
Why?
That's interesting. Because as Bangladesh, of course, growth started increasing, the economy became more diversified. Because of microfinance, because of other things, education programs, more girls were also out working, but many more men were working. And what parents were finding is that young sons were more likely to migrate.
Okay.
Also, sons were more likely to become more interested in their wives and children than in aging parents. daughters were beginning to work, maybe at home, maybe in the garment factories or whatever, but they didn't migrate very far, which meant that parents, as they got older, were finding that they could rely on their daughters to look after them, not just because they were earning, but because daughters, women, are regarded as more compassionate. And from daughters' point of view, they did want to support their parents, invest in their parents, because God knows that their marriages would not work. And who would they go back to? It would be to their parents and so on. So there was a very asymmetrical future unfolding. Sons were migrating, getting jobs, getting more interested in their wives and their children. Daughters were beginning to earn, but there's always this uncertainty about marriage. And so daughters stayed closer to their parents, and parents started to educate their daughters because they wanted to make sure that daughters had the capacity to look after them. So the whole book looks back at the history of Bangladesh, the history of government, the history of religion, the history of culture. As you know, Islam comes into a country and gets rooted in the local culture. So the kind of Islam we see in different parts of the world is going to be different. And the kind of Islam we saw in Bangladesh was different. And it allowed a certain degree of negotiability around gender relations. So that's basically the book. But what I've done is I've based it on the words of people, of fathers, of mothers, of sisters, of daughters, how they explain this paradox. So it's not a top-down approach. It's using people's own narratives, if you like, to explain what happened in Bangladesh.
There's much more that I understood from the book. And because I have been to Bangladesh, I understand Bangladesh a little bit. In the book, you talk a lot about NGOs, and you talk about how MDGs, they've been able to achieve MDGs while we have not been able to, and we are now in the SDGs world. What about the institutions, the government, the establishment, and support?
I mean, I gave you a very brief summary.
Okay.
It was not women, men, fathers, mothers doing it on their own. There was a broader institutional regime, if you like, and each of them played a role, a different kind of role. So if you like, what the donors did is, because they were so horrified at population rates in Bangladesh, they helped to pioneer a very responsive family planning program, which the government also supported. So when Pakistan and Bangladesh split, the fertility rates and contraceptive prevalence in both these wings were very low. It's really after liberation that we saw the acceptance of family planning. And these were, one thing that people understood is you have to get family planning to the women. It's women who are most likely to embrace family planning, because there's women who are having too many children, their health, mortality is suffering. So we got a new program which was managed. The field workers were all women. Of course, they were often accompanied by men, because at that time, a woman on her own couldn't go. But you would get these people going into villages and offering, it's a cafeteria approach. You don't offer just one or two methods. You offer a range of methods. So people can find out what suits them best. And for a lot of women, the pill was very convenient. But for a lot of women, they wanted to be sterilized. And of course, for religious people, sterilization is. But you would get women going in secret and getting sterilized. So that was one issue. Also, with the help of NGOs and, various donor agencies and so on, we pioneered one of the most effective ways of reducing cholera, of diarrhea. And that is oral rehydration therapy. You go to people's homes and you teach them, if your child gets diarrhea and is likely to get cholera, you give them a solution of water, of sugar, and of salt, and it cures them, And that went from house. What I think, and then you had the Food for Work program with special feeding for destitute women. You had rural maintenance program, because women could not work alongside men in Food for Work. So they had special programs for women only. But it meant you were building roads, and you were also being able to save. You had the Food for Education program, which then became the Cash for Education program. That helped both boys and girls, but boys more. Then you got a secondary school stipend for girls because a lot of girls dropped out at secondary level. So you got this program that gave parents the cash they needed to keep the girls into secondary school. So in the end, girls were becoming more educated than boys at primary and secondary level, not at tertiary level. However, before we become too excited about this, girls also dropped out of school.
Yeah.
But education, Mehnaz, has emerged in my book as a very powerful force for change. Even the poor quality education you might have had some schools. And I really puzzled over that in the book. What is it about education, even poor education, as long as the girl goes out to the school, that makes a difference? So yes, there was a whole, and then of course you got the garment industry, and it was international buyers that came to Bangladesh, cheap labor, docile labor, you get women. But from women's point of view, the work that they got in these factories were preferable to the work that they got in the field or as domestics. So it was an expansion of their working opportunities, and that too was important.
So you talk about patriarchal systems, and Bangladesh is still a patriarchy. And so how has it impacted the women's agency, impacted the patriarchal stronghold?
Although patriarchy in our parts of the world looks very powerful, very immutable, it can be changed. So my book is called Renegotiating Patriarchy. It's not called overthrowing patriarchy.
Okay.
It's not called transforming patriarchy. What you saw, and you see in these cultures, women cannot afford to lose the support of their families.
Yeah.
You have to be a very courageous woman to say to an abusive man, I'm walking out of this marriage. That takes courage. So what I think the women were doing were using these opportunities that were becoming available to them, plus their knowledge of their own culture, their knowledge of what it was that kept their in-laws or their husbands wanting to restrict them. So they used the opportunities and their knowledge of discourse, their knowledge of religious norms, of cultural norms, to find ways of, if you like, rethinking the meaning of what they were being told. The best example is when young women started to go to the factories. So they had to leave their villages and make their own way on their own to the towns. And of course, this goes strictly against parda norms, seclusion. But what they started to talk about is that, just because you cover yourself doesn't make you virtuous. Virtue is in the mind. So they talked about the parda of the mind. So they said, we go from the home, we go to the factory, we keep our eyes down, we cover our heads, not necessarily the veil, but nowadays, of course, they're wearing many more hijab and all that. But at that time, they just covered their heads and they said, if someone looks at me, that's their problem. I carry with me. So you get this image. I used to get this image of the home being like this enclosed corridor that took them to the factory. On the factory, of course, they were often working alongside men, but they still would maintain, we are like brothers and sisters. The employer is like my father. So this whole idea of fictive kinship, we call it. You turn everybody into your brother, your son, your father. So somebody said that the women who joined Grameen Bank, they had like over 1 million brothers because all the male workers in Grameen Bank were their brothers. And it just allows you that little scope for pushing. So I would say, yes, Bangladesh is still a patriarchy. But this issue of son preference is a real signifier of some fundamental shift, right? And that has been very important. Because as you know, in India, they also have had a fertility decline, but it's been accompanied by sex-selective abortion. So in India, we see many more boys being born than girls, which is unnatural.
Yeah.
I don't think that's happening in Pakistan. I don't know. No. But in Bangladesh, it never happened. But in Bangladesh, girls are more likely to survive. So no, we still have a patriarchy. And now with the Jubilee uprising, we don't know if there will be some kind of backlash. But something did change. Something important changed.
Professor Naila, how would you compare Bangladesh's situation with the Pakistani situation? While you're talking, I'm just continuously thinking about it. We have around about 26 million children out of school at this point, from age 5 to 16.
Yeah.
And okay, if the girls are going to schools, of course, they're doing much better than boys. And as you go up in the class system, they're in medical schools, they're outnumbering, they're lawyers, they're engineers, etc., etc. But then the job market is a big issue. In Bangladesh, you had the garment industries, but here, there is no really straight path. I mean, the quota systems are taken over by men. So how do you see us? Because you're an advisor, you're a global advisor as well. So how do you see, what positives are you seeing? What can we build on?
Well, your question began with what are the differences?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll talk to you a little bit about that. Something I've reflected on. My comparison in the book is much more with India. Okay. But I have thought a bit about Pakistan as well. And I think one of the things that Bangladesh has that has helped it is that it is a very homogenous society, culturally and religiously. Yes. We are, let us say 95% have a similar ethno-linguistic identity, where ethnicity is the same and the language is the same. I think 1% or 2% of indigenous people, and they don't get treated very well. But even the Hindus in Bangladesh are Bengalis. I think Pakistan had these 4 different provinces, 4 or I don't know how many it is now. But each province had its own culture, its own history, and so on. A very interesting thing was why the Green Revolution did so well in Punjab and Sindh, and very badly in Bangladesh until the late 80s. Because the Green Revolution, the early phase, was built for large-scale farms. Landholdings in Punjab and these places are huge. Yeah. Bangladesh has postage-size, tiny little farm sizes. Now, what do large landholdings mean? It's a much more feudal structure. You have large landowners and a lot of wage laborers. Bangladesh, you had a lot of wage laborers, but lots of tiny farmers. Yeah. Once you started to import small-scale equipment, tractors, 2-wheel tractors, tiny irrigation, the Green Revolution started to do well in Bangladesh. But what is that telling us? It's telling us that we have a far more feudal structure of landholdings in what we called West Pakistan, and a much flatter landholding picture.
Yes.
So I think that's a part of it, the ethno-linguistic homogeneity. Also, I think quite a lot of the energy straight after independence in 71, a lot of energy, there was a real idealism. We have become independent, And that's when we saw the beginnings of a very homegrown NGO sector, which started to take on women's issues, etc.
In Bangladesh?
In Bangladesh.
Okay.
They were not feminists, but they took on women. And I always think at around the same time, a lot of the feminists in Pakistan were spending their energy taking on Ziaul Haq. So they were not going into the countryside.
Yeah.
They were focusing on defending whatever rights they had. Bangladesh, we didn't have to do that because the leaders we had in Bangladesh all came from the same ethno-linguistic group.
Okay.
And because Bangladesh doesn't have a history of, we've been colonized for many years, a lot of these leaders came from quite modest backgrounds. They were known as the vernacular elite. They came out of small farmers who did quite well. So that distance between the rulers and the ruled, the rulers were one generation away from the countryside. Whereas in Pakistan, you had a much more urban elite, a much more, so there was much greater distance, I think, between the ruling class and the people.
It's interesting. I'd like to add that we are 4 provinces and 2 federally administered, Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Jammu and Kashmir. So what's very interesting here is what I'd like to mention to you is that although, because we have, in democracy, we have the elections and the elections are from constituencies, and the constituencies are urban and rural as well, and towns and all that. So people do get elected from the rural areas, but they actually do not reside there most of the time. And they have, they go there, they continue to, and they know what to do before the elections. What are the buttons to push, how to appease the people to continuously get elections. And elections are becoming more and more complicated, how to win them.
Of course.
So, that point is very good. And I would also like to mention here that NGOs, like the one that you have, BRAC and others, they have continued. And donors have also supported continuously. And I think donors have supported what is a homegrown concern. It's not.
I want to interrupt you a little bit there. When Bangladesh, the first few years of independence, donors regarded NGOs as the enemy. They're messing things up. It's only, I think, after 1990 that donors started to look at NGOs as their partners. So the early NGOs, BRAC and all, used to get funding from international NGOs like Oxfam and War on Want. So didn't get it from the main official donors. That came later.
What do you mean by official donors?
British donors, US donors.
Okay.
They didn't fund those organizations at the beginning.
Okay, so they were international NGOs that were
international NGOs.
Yeah.
Let us say Oxfam, let us say War on Want. People who shared the objectives of these NGOs. Later, by the late 80s, 1990s, donors started to call them civil society organizations, and they saw them as more effective than the state in reaching out to poor people and so on. So then they started to fund them.
Dr. Naila, unfortunately, in Pakistan today, we see a lot of restrictions on government restrictions and other restrictions on the NGOs. And also the drying up of donor financing, because obviously the NGOs are not there. I started my career with working with the Asia Foundation, and the job was to finance local organizations, NGOs that were just starting in Pakistan, early 90s. That's when I returned from IDS. And CBOs, community-based organization, in the absence of a local body system. And that was working very well. But eventually, we saw like NGOs rising, bigger NGOs, others. And now, because of these various great difficulties, bureaucratic difficulties and reports and audits and this and that. I mean, much more than anything that you can think of, it's like dying out. The NGO sector is totally dying out, and which is very, very concerning, because to me, NGO sector is important not just for service delivery or showing an interesting way of innovative way of doing service delivery, to idea generation as well. Our think tanks are also not that many in Pakistan. We don't have that many think tanks.
Well, that process has also been happening in Bangladesh. But a lot of the more smaller radical NGOs that believed in rights, human rights, that believed in gender equality and were very active and had collective action, those have started to fade out. For various reasons. They couldn't handle donor interest. So much money was coming their way, and they just went. But the BRACs and the Grameen's, the big ones, remained.
Yeah.
And some of the smaller radical NGOs have also remained. But what are you saying about, the projectization of NGOs? So rather than allowing them to deliver on a broader justice agenda, most of the ones that have survived have, Grameen Bank has done extremely well, but it is essentially about delivering microfinance to poor people. It's not necessarily about building the capacity of poor people to demand their own rights and so on. BRAC is more of a mixture. It provides microfinance, but it also provides legal training, knowledge of your rights, and so on. So the NGO sector is not as vibrant as it used to be. But at a very critical moment in our history, we had a very active, people talked about it, how active it was. And I think it's a pity, because I think your country, our country, we need a collective of different institutions to cooperate. NGOs, especially the ones that are grassroots based, have a knowledge and an access that governments can't have. On the other hand, governments have centralized, a larger mandate, and it is a good government cares about all its citizens. The private sector, as long as it be harnessed for the good of everyone rather than its own, board of shareholders, also has a huge role to play. So I wish, governments did not see NGOs and civil society as a threat. They should see them as potential partners, and there should be some mutual respect.
Yeah, we really do need to renegotiate the space. And especially what you said about the women's movement. Ours has been, in my opinion, in my personal opinion, has been co-opted. Women who were working with the women's movement became consultants. They started their own NGOs. And so it doesn't really have that thrust. And what you said earlier on really made sense, because that is a strategy and a tactic that I use, is that you don't threaten patriarchy. You don't
confront it.
No, confront it.
No.
But you have your own ways. So now, like, we have Aurat March in Pakistan, which is most detested. Like, it's, it's my body, it's my choice kind of thing. And they really, the right wing do not like that. So I think you can do it in a lot of other ways. And you need to, like, create a women's agency, like you wrote in the book. That is very, very necessary. Professor Naila, it brings me to the state and the women, children, men of the state being cared for. That concept of care, because you're here for a lecture, a workshop on social protection and care. And we had a long discussion on the concept of care, which got me thinking. And I'd like to give you my perspective, but I want to hear what are your thoughts on it and what's your work on it?
Well, a lot of my early work was focused on getting women into the labor market, or getting women an access to an income of their own. Because being a dependent all your life is really not good for your morale or your agency. So even if women could earn some little money of their own, I thought that's good. But what I began to gradually realize is what is blocking a lot of these women from accessing, even within the home, some money of their own, is this huge responsibility of unpaid care work, which men just do not participate in laws perhaps supervised. And as you know, I think Pakistan has one of the worst gender gaps in unpaid care, in the South Asia region. No, it's better than Afghanistan. But India comes after that. That means that there is all this work that's being done that is not recognized by anybody, not recognized in growth, not recognized in the state. Women are expected to, if they have to earn any money, it's on top of all their unpaid care work. And yet that unpaid care work is vital to the economy. It is vital to the well-being of their children, to the well-being of the family members, and to the well-being of the labor force that is going to help the country grow. So I've now started to shift to looking very much more closely at how do we, recognize unpaid care work, but it's not enough to recognize. How do we start to redistribute it, at least within the family? And if that's very difficult, because, men are not going to jump to helping in the unpaid work, how do we redistribute it with the larger society? Because one thing you should remember, the Bangladesh paradox, where did the changes first start happening? It's in the reproductive domain. It is in terms of fertility rates, in terms of infant mortality, child mortality, education. All of these things are within a domain where women have some power and say. So I've become far more interested in the whole issue of unpaid care work. And I think if you really, let's put the idea of growth to one side. If you try and think, how does a society generate the wealth and prosperity that will allow it to, look to the future in a much more optimistic way? It's allowing people to do what they are good at. You should not say to a whole half of humanity, the only thing that you can do really well is unpaid care work. So if you want people to realize their talents, their potential, you need to take on this, to this very unfair distribution of labor. It came home to me once when I went, a lot of microfinance, the loans go to the women, but the men seem to take it over. But in some households, the women were using their own microfinance. So I went to a woman and I said, how come that you're the one who's managing the whole financial? And she said to me, my husband is a very simple man. He likes to pray all the time. So he leaves, I have the head for business. So in their household, it was recognized. The husband was pious, he wanted to pray. So he left all the financial dealings to his wife. But that could be multiplied across the country. There are things that men can do or would prefer to do something else. And there are things that women could do if you allowed them to do it. So if you want to tap into the talent of your population, you should let people gravitate towards those activities that they are good at. And maybe we will find more men gravitating towards looking after children and looking after the family and taking more interest in the house. And maybe you'll find more women, taking on business or wanting to work and so on. So my point is that even if you're not thinking about growth, even if you're thinking just about how does a society make the most of its own potential, its own human potential, then it should not force people into one set of activities and deny them access to other kinds of activities. I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel that.
In your book, it's mentioned that social change can outpace economic growth outcomes and government and address cultural resistance through women's agency. So social change can outpace economic
Absolutely,
growth.
of course. I mean, if you look at the trends in the GDP, right, the gross domestic product, and trends in human development indicators, and trends in gender equality indicators, they don't all move in the same way. There are countries that do very well on social indicators and on gender equality. They're not particularly rich, but they do it well, A, because governments use their finances sensibly, and B, because you unleash the agency of people to make the changes they want to see in their lives. And in this case, the changes that women wanted to see resonated with what the government also wanted to see. They wanted to reduce their fertility rates. They wanted to send their children and their daughters to school.
So what was the umbrella over the creating the women's agency? I mean, is it a collective action? Is it women's networks?
Interestingly, I would say, and I wish as a feminist, I could say that it was women's collective action. But a lot of it was individual negotiations. And a lot of it happened because, on the one hand, poverty drives change, but on the other hand, opportunity sustains change. So you gave women these opportunities to go to school, to get to work, to work through microfinance, to work through garments. And all of these allowed women the possibility of rethinking the patriarchal bargain within their own homes. And I want to really emphasize that this was not a huge collective action of women's movements. No, there was a women's movement. It remains urban-based, but there was a huge NGO sector which was very much rural-based, and that talked about things like women's rights, etc. And that did form groups, But, a lot of the feminist literature is about heroic women's movements taking on patriarchy. No, this was below the radar negotiations. What the women's movement did was it took on the laws, right? And it changed the laws, and it's, violence against women and CEDAW and all of these other things. It did that, and it made possible a legal environment that made the difference. But they did not make the change. It's ordinary women and men that made the change.
It's interesting that you mentioned CEDAW here. So it's been 30 years of elimination of discrimination against women. So do these conventions matter anymore?
When you say anymore, that's a very telling phrase, because we're in a different era today. There's been a real backlash against gender equality and women's rights. But I think what these conventions like CEDAW represent is a coming together of an international feminist agency attempting to create norms at the global level, which can be taken up by different women's groups in different parts of the world to push for change. So now, will that make a difference in the future? We're in a very uncertain period. You talked about, NGOs being closed down. Well, civil society space is being closed down. We are seeing governments that used to be democratic not behaving very democratically anymore. We are seeing, wars in Europe, in the Middle East, elsewhere. And we are seeing this backlash. So I still think those conventions are hugely important.
Okay.
Because they give an international voice to the dreams and aspirations of ordinary people. And women have been able to use these conventions to put pressure on their own governments. If those conventions were not there, where would they turn?
Yes, that's the other side. And I feel that, we have to keep on revisiting the conventions to make them more relevant to this day and to this the younger generation as well.
Yeah.
They need it stands with a certain generation where these, you fought for the conventions, all these international dialogue and everything. But now it has to come down to, and maybe take them down to the village level, take them down to the district level. That's very, very essential.
Yeah.
And when you say about the international pressure, I do believe in it, because I always say this to EU or others, to the US partners, that, when you are talking to my government, say this. And then people just say to me that, why are you saying that? And I say, because it's international pressure. And it does matter. Naila, one of your areas is labor force participation. Now in Pakistan, we haven't had a labor force survey since 2022. And the 22 survey shows that women participate in the labor force. Only 20% of the women participate in the labor force, which is so totally untrue. So how do you see the labor market and the growing labor market and the inclusion of, which to me will be like an advice to my government as well, or to the people or women working in this area, as to how important it is to factor in women's labor force participation, and also what they're doing for care?
Well, you know, the restrictions on women being able to enter the visible labor force that is measured and counted are very, very strong. And I think they're quite strong in Pakistan. This does not mean that women are not working. And it does not mean that women are not doing the kinds of work that the ILO recognizes as unpaid productive work. You know, they're rearing cattle, they're growing crops, they're doing all these things, but they're not counted. So, you know, Pakistan's economy, if it has such a low labor force participation, is benefiting, is free riding on the unpaid or unrecognized work of women, and often unpaid. And one of the things, and here I think patriarchies vary. In some kinds of patriarchies, men are able to accommodate the fact that women in their households will go out to work. I think in Pakistan, even today, and and I would say in northern India and also in Bangladesh, it seems to affect masculinity, you know, a sense of masculinity that your wife is going out to work. So if she works, she must not be seen to work. And therefore, she's not earning any money, you know. So I think, again, going back to my earlier point about the talents of people, unpaid care work remains extremely important and valuable. But that doesn't mean that you have to stay at the home all day long. You know, you could have other people in the house helping you. You could have community-based creches, you know, care services. You could have government supporting care work, early child development, which is a very good intervention, by the way, earlier. I really think the government has these governments have fallen into a kind of GDP trap.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the only thing that matters is if it can be counted as part of the official labor force. If I go back again, if you want to harness the talent of the people of your country, you need to provide them with support for those aspects of care that are critically important, in order that they are able to participate much more in the labor force. And that participation in the labor force also gets rid of what I think of as the gender segmentation of the economy. So women are only able to enter those forms of jobs that are compatible with all their domestic chores, i.e. they work at home or near the home. You want to allow women to go to where productive jobs are, you know, where better paid jobs are. And if they are able to go there, then that, you know, segmented, you know, men do this and women do that, you would find much more flexibility in the kinds of jobs that men and women are able to do. So I think, you know, it requires a real shift in mindset for women themselves to acknowledge that the unpaid care work that they do is valuable, but to also acknowledge that, you know, the fact that you don't have to stay in the house all day long. A lot of that unpaid care can be shared and done by others as well as you. So I think that is something, it's going to take a while to change. But, you know, some of the work that you've been doing, you know, on corporal punishment, on domestic workers, all of these things are interventions in the care economy. You know, if domestic workers are not treated well, it's a symptom of the fact that care work is not respected. We should see domestic workers as people who are enabling women who are slightly better off to go out in the market. But those domestic workers are doing as valuable a job as those women were doing before. So I think this degree of respect you give to people. I remember my friend Simeen Mahmood, who I worked with a lot. She said, you know, it's so unfair in Bangladesh that the prime minister of the country is a woman and she's going around all over. Everybody respects her. But if a poor woman tries to go anywhere, immediately she's regarded as somehow dishonorable. So
Yeah.
there's this kind of culture of what kinds of work are valued and what are not. And the harder the work, the less valued it is.
I'd like to now ask you about state and women, the relationship of state and women, the gender and the state. Here in Pakistan, what we are faced with right now is that we are 148 out of 148 in the gender parity report of the World Economic Forum.
Oh, I
The
didn't know
last. So I went to kind of a workshop where we were talking about what's the reason, and the person was there from the World Economic Forum, representative in Pakistan, and he said that some of the areas that were in question were not answered, which were data related. So we don't even have reliable data for women. And then they pointed out to something that, you don't have enough women in the cabinet. So from the face of women on the big, the top posts, to everyday women counting data and all of that. So it's not there. And I bring it back to the state. And when you look at the budget of Pakistan, 25-26, it's not gender segregated. Women are somewhere there. They are the indirect recipients of. Women and children are not there. And so that's very problematic. So what did you see in Bangladesh? Because the state has been supportive. So what are the lessons? And secondly, my second question, what are the lessons that we can learn from Bangladesh to the Pakistan experience?
This idea of gender budgets, it's a tool of accountability.
Okay.
You're telling your government, look, none of this money, we don't know where this money is going, and we certainly don't know if it's benefiting women or men. I don't think gender budgeting was the main tool in Bangladesh. I think the government from 1971 onwards, first with the issue of quotas, But what I really think was valuable was less, I know you were a parliamentarian, but I think less valuable than having women at the top is having women in local government. And so we had quotas in local government. They began out as quotas that were nominated by whichever party won. But then they became, you had to stand for elections within a quota system. I think that business of local government representation, and what that meant is what the women's organizations would work with the women who got elected to tell them what their rights were, to tell them what they should be doing, to not allow the men in the local government to push them into one side. So you have this interaction between women getting elected and then getting access to all this training. So I won't say it's ideal by any means. Nothing in the world is ideal, but it's an improvement on what we had in the past. So I would, so it's about political will, right? And political will is not about monitoring the budget. You're effective in monitoring the budget if you're recognized as having something useful to say. So I would say that what you need in Pakistan is first of all, it is very shameful that they don't have data. We don't know if they're 148 because there's no data or because they're genuinely 148.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't know. But why don't we know? The fact that we don't know, the fact there's no data is telling us that the government is not collecting the data. So I think this issue of data information research is how we get to know our own countries, how it works. So I put a great deal of emphasis on grounded research, which tells us what is blocking women. So I'm going to focus on local government.
Okay.
What is blocking women from getting into local government? Do they need quotas? With the history of women being absent in government at all, the quotas are to break with history. And so you may need those quotas to get. But is the government, whichever government you have at the moment, there's been a bit of a turnover. Are these governments interested in wanting women to have a role in even local governance? Or is it something that women should organize, unify around? Because the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap, across the world, women have done reasonably well in human capabilities, right? Health, education, etc. The gap is larger in the economic sphere. The gap is largest in the political sphere. Because in the political sphere, the decisions are made that make a huge difference to what happens in the rest of the economy. So I think it's very, very important for women to, and I say start local before you go national.
Yeah, because in your book, what was very stark is that it's not about top to bottom, but it's bottom to top.
Absolutely.
That's very endearing.
Yeah.
And then I'm looking at, unfortunately, we don't have local government system in Pakistan. So it's very, very top down.
Ayub Khan introduced it with the basic democracy long time ago.
Yes. Then again, Musharraf also introduced it, and so they have been, and we are still pushing for it.
Yeah.
So you're saying that some of the answers lie in the local body. Now, what we have here, I'd like to share it with you, is what we have here is a very, very strong presence of women in bar associations, which are at the district level, which are at the union councils
That's
level.
a huge plus.
Yeah. So they are organized and they are mobilized because it took them a lot of effort to get there. So I think we can start from there even.
I think so. And I think, again, I don't know how much this is an organized force, these women in the law. But, getting the right laws onto that is a huge importance. Even if they're not implemented, I just think laws, and what I think is really important about laws? Laws can be influenced, they are made. Custom, tradition, religion are given. You can take, the law is something that you make, and you should be a part of making it. And sometimes it may have to go against your culture. If your culture is not treating people right, it may have to go against it. And that's why I think the law, I often have this belief in the law, because it allows you to counter oppressive forms of tradition and culture. So I feel that you should really work with these women lawyers.
Yes. So I have another very good news to share with you, that recently for Islamabad Capital Territory, the law is passed on children's age constraint in marriage. And they were, the biggest right-wing party said that they're going to come on the streets. And they didn't, because the president, the president is very forward-looking, and he signed off the law, because eventually the law goes to become an act. And it had become, it was tabled over the last 15 years, at least 4 times in the National Assembly.
So what is the age at the moment? What was the age?
It is, we exactly don't have an age, but 14. So, and it differs because now everything is now decentralized to the provinces. In Sindh, it's 18. Islamabad Capital Territory is the second area to adopt to the age of 18. And other, provinces should follow also. But, there was a point where we thought that our, right-wing parties are going to come out on the streets against it, and which seemed so silly.
I wonder, these right-wing parties, do they care about people? Age of marriage, for a young girl, age of marriage, it has lifelong consequences. It's about the age of first birth. It's about your mortality rates. It's about your health. It's about whether you continue to get education. So if you are against giving, an age of marriage that is reasonable, then you're against the interests of that child. So I don't understand what kind of humanity would be against it. Because maybe we didn't know that in the past. But we know now that to be married off too young means you have children too young, means your education is stopped. It means, it has lifelong consequences for you. So I fail to understand why they should be against it.
But this is an absolute win for Pakistan, for to have it.
Yeah.
I don't know, we may not have rules to implement it, but it's there.
Well, it sends a signal.
Yeah.
It sends a signal.
Yes. So, Professor Naila, about the July uprising, which has had deep impact on Bangladesh, and also, it has had impact on a very positive impact on the relationship of both countries, Pakistan and Bangladesh. So, in your book, how do you consider it? And then in long term, how do you consider that? And especially on its impact on women?
I end my book by asking, can the Bangladesh paradox continue? Can the progress that we have enjoyed all this time, it's just been remarkable. can it continue? And one of the things I say in the book, and this book came out just before or just around the time of the uprising. So we're not as poor a country as we were, but with economic growth has come huge inequality. We still have governance. You saw that Hasina was overthrown because of an extreme autocracy. Right?
Yeah.
And patriarchy hasn't gone away. I think the July uprising is giving the country a breathing space to think about the future. But I am not very optimistic.
Why do you say that?
Well, because one of the things we've done is banned the Awami League. Now, as wrong as the leadership of the Awami League was, you cannot ban a party that has a mass following. You can't do that because what you've done is you've deprived all its followers of a voice. I think you try its leaders and you do something about that, but you can't do that. And in that space, I think the parties that are now coming to the forefront have, the ability to compete in the new elections, which they would not have done if it was a much more pluralistic democracy. And I fear that we may be in for the kind of gender backlash that we are seeing in other countries. I don't see that the students appear to be doing that well on, there were women out on the streets in the July uprising. In fact, it was a group of women students that possibly began the July uprising. But since that came to an end, we're seeing that it's like going back to the old business as usual. Now, my hope is that the new promise of democracy, the new promise of non-discrimination, which is what the July uprising was about, I wish we could take it to the countryside. Because that's where I think the Bangladesh paradox happened. And if we could take that message to ordinary fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters in the countryside, I would be much more optimistic. But I'm not seeing that attempt happening at the moment. I'm seeing it very much as a struggle that's taking place in urban areas. And in urban areas, extremes can flourish.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm not that optimistic. But I pray to God that I proved wrong. I am often wrong.
No, you're not often wrong. But at this instance, I think it's in the interest of both the countries, especially Bangladesh. And we have a lot of lessons to learn from Bangladesh. Your garment industry, the way you have controlled fertility rates, the way you have prospered in terms of education and in terms of this women's labor force participation.
I wish the entire subcontinent were less at each other's throats. Just look at us, To go to Pakistan from Bangladesh, I have to go via Colombo or I have to go to Doha. Why can't I fly over India? But, there's all this issue. The entire subcontinent seems to be enemies of each other. So the more we start to get rid of that animosity, I think the better it will be for the whole region.
There's no longer any SARC. The women's group getting together and, once India pulled out, we don't have that kind of a chance. But you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
There have to be some sentiment, some sense prevailing in India to join. Child rights, women's rights, women's shared experiences and all that. It's just a black hole when I look at India. I haven't been to India in Modi's time.
No.
It's very dangerous. I don't think I'm going to get a visa even. I haven't asked for it. But I do miss that. I do miss that. I don't know whether it's still strong. The women's movement is still strong in India or not.
Well, it's under the same sort of anything progressive, I think, at the moment in India faces the kind of resistance of this government. So, work around minorities, religious and Dalit minorities, those studies have been closed down. Women's studies have been closed down. So I don't think, it's a great time for India either. It's facing, it's lost a certain degree of moral authority it had in the subcontinent. I think it's lost that.
So what can we, whoever we are not the state, we are strong women in our own domains. What can we do together to influence, let's say, the region?
Well, I think we should start meeting in a third country, or Nepal or Sri Lanka, which seems still to be a bit more open. And I think women's movements, women's organizations, human rights organizations, people who believe in tolerance towards all religions rather than, asserting their own primacy, I think we need to get together and start speaking out against this, this kind of attempt to homogenize the citizens of any one country. I am sure there are many people in India who miss coming to Pakistan or miss going to Bangladesh and who feel less of this animosity that we hear in the political domains. I don't know. But I grew up I was born in India before I went to East Pakistan. I went to school in India. So I have a lot of affection for ordinary people in India. And we were all one country once. So it's always interesting to come back here. And we have so much in common. We may speak different languages. But our history, our food, our culture, I don't think anybody appreciates each other's food in South Asia as South Asians.
Yeah.
You go to South India, you come to Pakistan, as you saw the other day. We love each other's food. And, I always say, Shakespeare said, if music is the food of love, I always say in South Asia, food is the food of love. You feed people, don't you?
That's optimism, while Modi is saying that he will get into the second round of war with Pakistan.
No.
So
that's not going to do India any good. It's not going to do Pakistan any good. It's not going to do the world any good.
Yeah.
And any victor out of this is a very Pyrrhic victory. It's not worth having.
And that's when we lose out on, focusing on our citizens, focusing and benefiting our citizens, because everything is in terms of the defense of a country. And that seems the global way right now, defense.
Yeah. But, I can see there's wars and then, armies. One of the things I thought about, and it came out of something I read around COVID or around one of these pandemics. In a part of Latin America, they got the army out to help and things. And you think to yourself, all of us are spending a huge amounts of money on armies that don't do anything. Only when there's a war, they go out and fight. The rest of the time, they're just sitting and eating and being looked after. I think we should have more constructive uses of our armies.
The Pakistan army is out there because it's very organized. So like in terms of flood, right now they're out helping in the floods.
That is excellent to hear.
Yeah. So in times of floods, in times of any kind of devastation, in times of
but that's
any kind
being
of
useful,
threats,
right?
So they are there.
Yeah.
So they are there. They're the frontliners. That's how we use our army. We don't let them idle.
Okay. I'm very pleased to hear that. Because if you think of how much of your budget is going on the army, it's good that they're doing constructive work in peacetime.
Yeah. Professor Naila, so what's the future of global alliances in terms of strengthening women's agency within a country, within a district, within a tehsil level, especially for the region?
One of the lessons that come out of my book, and I'm going to go back to that, is that you have to work with what you've got, right? It's no use having some formula from somewhere else. You have to work with what you've got. And so you mentioned all these different levels. Really, the work has to begin at the local level. However you want to frame it, we have to learn from each other. So, I came to this workshop around unpaid care and social protection. We could have more of these workshops because there's so much to learn from each other. What the Benazir Income Support Program is doing.
It's a very good program.
Yes. But one of the things I've heard is it's not being evaluated enough. We need to understand, where does this BISP work well? Where is it not working well? And what can we do about that? So I think even coming together, not on a hugely political agenda, but on a development agenda that is about promoting women's access to resources and opportunities, there's a lot we can learn from each other. And if it means that we meet, I don't know how difficult it is to get into India now, but I meet South Asian scholars in in other forums. So I think working with what we've got means taking whatever opportunities there are, but also looking at the international level. The UN women are still active. You look to the more progressive donor agencies. People have very black and white attitudes towards donors. Some donors are progressive and some are not.
Yeah.
You work with the progressive donors. You look for leadership at the local level that's progressive. I think because women have been shut off from, the main sources of power, they have learned to make do with the small opportunities that they get. And I'm afraid that's where we're at now again. With all the closing down of NGOs, political space, backlash, we have to go back to the basics of looking for the opportunities that might help us and being very pragmatic about it. And trying to, and this, I haven't said as much as I should, trying to get as many men to be on your side as possible. I think that is the key.
Absolutely a must.
Yeah. And I'm sorry I left it to the end.
Professor Naila, you've done so much. You've written books and papers, advised globally. But to me, I was your student in the early 90s at the Institute of Development Studies. To me, it's your energy. It's your passion, your compassion, which is still there. I mean, I look at you and I just say, oh my God, I mean, my energy is lost. So tell me about your life and this ongoing energy of just changing and in these dire situations also, finding hope, wanting to link. So I want to know about your life, your education, and what led you to do such great work and make and be a change maker.
Well, it's very immodest to say I did such great work but I think the energy is a valid point. And I still feel very energetic, although I've just retired. I had a very powerful mother. I mean, she was a professor of history. And, she was quite left-wing in her own way. She founded a landless organization for women. And one thing if there was a message that she left with me is, and it's a message I'm hearing from women from Bangladesh, always stand on your own feet. So from the very beginning, I never saw my life as being dependent on others, but that I would stand on my own feet. I also think quite early on, I decided as an academic that I wanted my work to reach other people. So I've always written in a way that is accessible and I've always wanted, I don't know, it's a difficult question to answer, but I've always identified with the underdog, right? In whatever situation it is, I feel a lot of empathy with people who I feel are not being heard or not being listened to. So that gives you a passion, So it's not about getting women to the top, women who are already powerful, but it's always been about how does one address, the power structures at the very bottom. And I've always been very interested in making change. How does change happen and what can we do about it? I think these are things that give you passion, So for me, an academic career has not just been about publishing in academic journals that no one reads. It's always about understanding the world and then trying to communicate that.
Your research has been very strong. You've gone down to the village level.
Yes, I've always done field work.
Yeah, you've done a lot of field work.
But I do believe in mixed methods. So even in the book, you will see there's lots of tables at the end.
Yeah.
So I'm not making claims that are not also often backed up by statistical data and so on. So I like that. And a lot of my friends come out of my work, So I remember somebody said to me, oh, you're going but that's work. I said, no, that's not work. I'm meeting friends and then we're going to talk about work. But, I don't make these very clear-cut distinctions between work and life. So what I do, I've been very fortunate that I've found a way to do work that is a part of my life, and that I link with activists, I link with policymakers. So it's great.
Thank you, Professor Naila Kabeer. You're a legend. And thank you for coming to Pakistan to talk about social protection and care, and especially keeping the Benazir Income Support Program in mind. We really appreciate your visit, and I hope that you'll continue to visit. And we're so proud of your work. And I think it's very important that we connect regionally and to be able to move ahead, at least the women, and then push the men to do that. We have, in Pakistan, we have a lot of lessons to learn from your work and your guidance through your work. Thank you very much for joining me here in Islamabad.
And thank you, Mehnaz. And I want to take a little bit of credit for all the achievements you've made.
Thank you, Pakistan, Hamisha Zindabad.